So I have a tendency to create settings a lot, or I should say with a lot more ease than I do actually writing stories. Um, this has always been a benefit to me, excuse me, when I'm running role-playing games and things like that. I can build a world, or at least a background to a world, a heck of a lot easier than I can zoning in on the nitty-gritty details of actually writing a narrative through the perspective of characters and events and things like that. I've always been much better at that than I have been at actually writing a story about heroes and protagonists and things like that. I started thinking a couple of years ago when Cyberpunk 2077 was first announced. It reignited in me an interest in the genre. I've always had, kind of a sci-fi bent in my interests, amongst other things. I have several different subject matters and genres that I get interested in and have brief manias over in a sort of cyclical fashion. And cyberpunk, things like that, was one of them. And it got me thinking about the cyberpunk movies I'd seen as a kid. And one of them was Johnny Mnemonic with Keanu Reeves, now of John Wick fame. But not talking about the short story, which is similar, but not exactly to the movie. The character of Johnny Mnemonic in Johnny Mnemonic, he's a courier. He carries data from point A to point B with a hard drive wired into his head. The dramatic conceit of that particular story was that for some reason, in order to hold data in your head, you must then also sacrifice your own memories, as though the hard drive in your head is wired specifically into your brain, and your brain is compensating for data storage space. Now, of course, this movie and the script accompanying it was written long before we ended up in the world of flash drives and gigabytes worth of storage space that you can hold in your hand. So that doesn't really track anymore with modern technology. But it got me to thinking, under what circumstances would you have in our world a situation where you would actually have to deliver data manually? Like you'd have to run data as a physical commodity. Because these days, obviously, you can just upload or email or send over the internet, hundreds of gigabytes of information in a couple of hours or less, depending on your connection. There's no need for a courier, short of you being in a situation where you're out of range of a Wi-Fi connection. And so I was thinking about cyberpunk. I was thinking about that, and I was trying to sort of reverse engineer the idea. What circumstances would need to occur to create a world where physical delivery of data became a thing? So what I'm going to do, for anybody who happens to be listening to this, and because I don't know, I can't seem to come up with a way to write a story in detail. I mean, I tried writing a story within this setting that I've created. But I don't know, I have problems focusing. I thought I would just throw this out into the ether. Now, first, as a preamble, I cannot say that anything I've come up with is 100% original. In fact, there are aspects to the backstory that's apparently been created for Cyberpunk 2077, which I didn't know when I read this, or I should say when I wrote this. Boy, my brain's all over the place. So there is some sort of spontaneous generation between my ideas and whatever they were thinking of for 2077. But maybe someone could take this and write their own stories, or maybe this is a setting that someone could turn into a a role-playing session for themselves. I don't know. But I've written up a sort of brief background to this setting. I will read that, and then, well, you can do with it what you will, and I might expand on it a little bit as I go. So here's what I came up with. How do you arrive at a situation where the actual physical delivery of data is a thing? And just as a side note, the reason I thought about this was in my work, there was a time several years ago where we had to process data from a particular source that could only send it to us in physical magnetic tape cassettes. Not like the audio cassettes you'd play an album on from the 80s or something, but these sort of very retro, bulky data tapes. Because the system they used was from the 1980s, and apparently that was the only way they could transmit the data. And I found that really kind of retro cool. And I always thought, wow, they had to send us these data tapes rather than email us a file or something. So what would turn back the clock on that a little bit, but still exist within our world? So here's what I came up with. And I'm reading from my my little text document here. A series of high-profile events involving the misuse of the open internet has culminated in an Internet 9/11. Travel itineraries for several foreign diplomats were hacked and used in a coordinated series of assassinations, while at the same time the captured information, both that which was used in the killings and information about upcoming diplomatic travel, was dumped onto the internet through multiple social media platforms, as well as being hacked into displaying on the front pages of several major news websites. This sudden broadcasting of sensitive information, combined with the knowledge that information of future events was as well compromised, resulted in the unprecedented move of the internet being shut down to all but official governmental entities. For 4 days, later to be known as the First Four Dark, nearly everyone in the industrialized world was blind, deaf, and dumb along the information superhighway. When service was restored on the 5th day, it came back only in stages, and with hastily applied restrictions on the ability of average people to access service, and almost no ability for any uploads of data to occur. While most of the perpetrators of the actual killings were eventually caught or killed, the person or persons responsible for the data breach were never cleanly identified or located, and subsequent smaller breaches of data, and injuries to civilians as a result, continued to occur. In response to this and the prior events, the European Union passed legislation implementing the broadest restrictions on public access to the internet in the Western world. Partnering with all of the major ISPs, the EU became the various corporations' partner, a relationship that all but in name made the Internet of Europe a governmental department. Other Western allies soon followed suit, with the Internet Safety and Security Act, or ISA, being passed in the United States. It established a system of closed internet networks available to and maintained by individual municipalities, with all city networks being connected by a master pipe that was accessible only by the government. Documented residents of any city with a network would be allowed access to view and share content, but would only be afforded limited ability to upload any original content. And all consumption or broadcasting of content is tied to the identification of the user. Internet activity is never, ever private. And each of these closed city nets represents the full extent of how far any individual can reach with their information. Communication using voice over IP extends only as far as the closed network, or, in limited instances, within a particular region. The New York network, the NY net, for example, covers a far larger expanse of geography than, say, the network in Phoenix, Arizona. All long-distance voice communication dissolved into old analog format, with long-distance charges, once thought to be a thing of the past, being resurrected. Over time, this balkanization of the internet, with networks being limited to cities, and some cities only being able to afford lesser networks, if at all, led to an unintended feudal system of data access and consumption. As well, with the cutting off of all long-distance electronic traffic, save for governmental business or banking commerce, online retailers had to set up shop city by city, with brick and mortar storefronts making a necessary comeback. As well, since data could no longer be transmitted in bulk via email or file transfer protocols over long distances, the need for physical movement of information in storage devices became an essential part of everyday business. Thus, the data runner and the industry thereof was born. Now, data is a quantifiable, tangible commodity, and entities, both legitimate and otherwise, go to great lengths and sometimes take even greater risks to get their information from one place to another. And consequently, a scourge of the long forgotten past has risen to prominence in an increasingly desperate world: the highwaymen. As well, those skilled in the art of hacking take great risks, and only for great rewards, to slip data into the long-distance pipeline controlled by the government to ensure a more secure but highly illegal transmission. So that's the rough setting I came up with. A situation where the internet is no longer worldwide, but it is localized, balkanized. If you are traveling between major metropolitan areas, your cell phone just doesn't work. There's no network to connect to. You can't send data between Los Angeles and New York unless you are having someone physically move data tapes from one point to another, or a USB drive. And in fact, I thought that maybe high density storage devices for data might become outlawed or restricted only to government entities. Something like that. Now, obviously, I haven't, reverse engineered every single detail of what would actually be involved in arriving at this situation in the real world. Few fictional settings actually do that. I'd be hard pressed to think of one that does. But I don't know. I was just trying to think of, because whenever I read Neuromancer, or I see the footage of the Cyberpunk game coming out, while it is set in a sort of futuristic science fiction / fact setting, there's always an element of fantasy to it. I think it was Arthur C. Clarke who said something to the effect of, any technology advanced enough looks like magic to anybody who doesn't know what it is. So, Cyberpunk 2077 is sci-fi. There's a lot of gritty / realism there, but there's a certain sort of magical notion to some of how some of those mechanics work, both in the world and otherwise. So I tried to think of a situation where in our real world, how would it operate? Not people with cybernetic arms or things like that, but how would we operate if, information exchange, the internet, technology becomes more and more cloistered to major metropolitan areas rather than having access to everyone? And if you had to move data from point A to point B, and your only option, unless you were a governmental office, was to move it physically, what kind of industry would be built up around that? What kind of risks would be built up around that? And consequently, what kind of criminal enterprise could be built up around that? So I thought of several scenarios, like this could be a story. This could be the setting for a role-playing game where, you have a world where in between major metropolitan areas, you effectively have a, information wasteland where trying to connect with another person is set back into like the 50s, essentially. Like you'd have to get on a regular old phone line to contact somebody. But once you get into the city, you're suddenly in the 21st century again. Something like that. An interesting little world of oases of information technology prosperity, and then you've got the barrens around these places and in between. You have stagecoaches effectively delivering information from one place to another that might be valuable to a corporation or to a specific entity or something. And then you have highwaymen, bandits, who raid these things and hold that data hostage or use it for their own ends or something like that. I don't have much else to say about the setting. I started writing a specific story around a character who was a illegal data runner, sort of a noir running from the bad guys kind of thing. And I have a few pages written on that. But you kind of, at least for myself, I should say, I kind of hit a wall. I've always been a much better big idea guy than I am getting into the nitty gritty of things, except in very small doses. Now, of course, I suppose I could write a several different, series of small doses and, put them all together into one big story, but that's apparently not how my mind works. So I'm just kind of throwing this out into the ether on the chance that someone finds it interesting or might be able to use it to write their own stories. I was thinking the other day, because of a tweet about the writer's circle that H.P. Lovecraft created, where he'd essentially said, the mythos and the stories and the characters I've come up with, the settings, they're effectively open source. And I invite other writers to take these ideas and run with them. And several authors that became famous in their own right afterwards did. Now, I don't have any such high-minded ideals for myself or this setting that I've come up with. And again, I'm not going to say that what I've come up with is 100% original. I've not read every science fiction book ever written. I've not read every quasi-cyberpunk story that's ever been told. But this is what I've come up with. So if this happens to inspire somebody's role-playing game setting, if this happens to inspire someone's writing in some way, if you have your own ideas about how to extend the universe or some scenario to put into it, by all means, put it into the comments. If you go off by chance and use this for your own project or something, just keep me informed. I'd be appreciative. I'll go to the chat now, see who's shown up of my viewers on my other channel. There's information in the description for that if you're curious. See, Stargazer Nuts is applauding. Thank you, Stargazer. Johnny Hellcat says hello. Circus Zero says, oh shit, I thought this was video. I didn't know it was a stream. Well, yeah, doing a video on this would be a little complicated. And I found out, I didn't know that I could. I didn't know that I could stream on this channel. I thought that I had to hit several other requirements. I can't monetize this channel yet because the subscriber count is very low, but I can stream. And since this subject matter is decidedly a departure from my main channel, I didn't think it belonged there. So I thought I'd put it over here as an experiment, just to like a little thing for those that might be interested. And also for my own sort of creative catharsis. See, Johnny Elgett says, even if they were outlaws, large amounts of data, it could always be compressed. Well, that's the thing. Like I say, if high-capacity data storage devices were restricted to the government agencies or law enforcement or something, sort of like, ammunition. Some laws want to restrict the amount of ammunition a civilian can have versus a military person can have. I was thinking along those lines. Like if you did have a situation where data or the access to data or the availability of massive amounts of data became a danger, a national security risk to an extent that it became a 9/11 thing. Like I said, I was thinking 9/11 because what happened during 9/11? Well, they shut down all the airports. Well, if you had an information equivalent where information got out that was a danger to multiple national diplomats or diplomatic security between nations. I just thought, well, the a realistic response might be to shut down the internet, and that is the sort of one uber fantastic element that I came up with for this setting. I seriously doubt in reality you could shut down the whole of the internet, but like I say, in a sort of a extreme scenario, for the sake of fiction, I could imagine something like that occurring. Let's see. Sam Core says, "Does your world allow dial-up BBS 56K or 28.8K modems?" Maybe, like maybe the outlaws or the pirates on the fringe of the city networks arrange, smaller sort of private networks based on old technology that is still somewhat available or can be cobbled together by the general public, whereas access to all the stuff that we sort of consider now either commonplace or more advanced in the decades to come can only be purchased by government agencies or very wealthy corporations, things like that. Maybe. I mean, that's one possibility. There are sort of pirate networks out there, sort of like pirate radio networks in the olden days. Circus says ransoming data would be one criminal activity that would pop up. Exactly. Like if you knew you were intercepting the data delivery for Microsoft, and you knew this was like this was the new release of their new product or something going off to the, I don't know, whoever. Yeah, you could try to ransom it. And that would, of course, require a whole extra level of security and discretion and precautions taken by corporations to secure their data from point A to point B. There's a whole like domino effect to this notion of criminality and response to threats of criminality that would create all sorts of stories. Let's see. Johnny Helget says data bootlegging. Yeah, I mean, you could hijack a shipment, find a way to copy it all, and then run away with it, and then hold the copies for ransom. Something like that. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of ways you could do it. Jack Gunsky says, "Hi, Scribe." Hi, Jack. Jack Gunsky says, "So essentially, you'd have bootleggers with flash drives." Yeah, well, maybe flash drives. Like I said, flash drives would probably be government restricted. And any leftover from the olden days would probably be illegal to possess by normal people. Now, again, obviously, there are zillions and zillions of flash drives out there, so maybe some precaution would be taken or some update would be given to prevent old versions of flash drives to be able to hold modern data. I don't know. This is where we get into sort of like the quasi-fantasy science aspect of such a story. MCR and Doniger, black market sells porn overseas. Porn cost more because of distance required to bring them over. Exactly. There's a whole, like if you set up a situation where the internet is no longer worldwide, if it is a series of closed networks in the cities that can afford to maintain such a thing, and then the only thing connecting those is a all-encompassing governmental pipeline, then getting access to that pipeline would be both very risky and potentially very rewarding for someone trying to break the law. But then if you're traveling between cities, like I say, you're essentially into no man's land between Houston and Arizona or something. If you're out on the freeway, you're literally in a desert, and figuratively in a desert of connectivity to the rest of the world. When you're in New York, you're in the 21st century. When you're heading towards Wisconsin, you're suddenly shunt back into the technology of the 50s. I was trying to think of a situation where you could have a peaceful Fallout scenario. Fallout is a setting that's sort of like is stuck in the 1950s, or sort of a quasi-technological version of the 1950s. What if, a good majority of our society and population were forced to live technologically in the past because of threats to the overall security of the nation on the basis of an open internet otherwise? So I was trying to think of all these fears about WikiLeaks and Russia interference and all this other stuff, and like, what take into the extreme? What could we imagine? Because you can't avoid the existence of the internet or interconnected networks or things like that, but you could restrict them. What if the worst scenario, the worst case scenario of the EU over what it considers to be threats, the worst case scenario of those that want to shut down things like WikiLeaks. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Trump administration, the Obama administration, you know, the uber privatizing or governmental control over networks to secure our nation, etc. So that's what I was thinking about. That was the sort of the scenario I was imagining. See, Jack Gunsky says, it does solve a problem that's afflicted lots of writing today. Cell phones have eliminated the restriction of information that makes many stories possible. Yeah, and you'll see that in a lot of movies these days that are sort of set a few years back in the 80s or something. And cell phones are the bane of just about every horror movie now. I mean, nearly all the classic horror movies, save for those that are intimately supernatural, would be defeated with a cell phone. I remember a couple of years ago, I watched the remake of I Spit on Your Grave. And almost immediately, with like in the first 15 minutes, they had the protagonist accidentally drop her cell phone in the toilet as she's out in an isolated cabin somewhere. They have to come up with reasons to get rid of the cell phone. So yeah, if you're outside of the city limits and your cell phone is out of range of connecting to the city network, either you're going to hope you can tap into some pirate network nearby if you actually need help, and then you'd have to hope that that pirate network is somehow connected to the local authorities. Otherwise, you're going to have to find a landline. There's a whole bunch of interesting things you could do if you move from one point of geography to another in a world where some are connected and some are completely not. Sam Core says, mainstream media is probably more powerful because people can't get alternate sources of information easily. They control narratives way easier. That too. If the networks are closed, I keep coming back to Houston for some. I think it's because I set part of the story that I was starting to write in Texas, because Texas has just huge areas of just nothing in between cities and things, and I thought it was a good setting for this to set this up. Also a border state. The entire network of Houston, both in information dissemination and everything else, could be exceedingly biased. Maybe what Houston is telling you isn't the truth of what's happening in Los Angeles. Would you know? Would you have any way to connect and find out without, someone sending you a note or a letter? The sending letters would become more prominent again as people try to transfer information without having to deal with data tapes and stuff. Because the post office the mail would still go through. So you'd see the post office probably coming back to prominence. But yeah, anyway, that's the gist. And I could sit here for hours as my mind does work to consider all the different contingencies and variations on that idea that might affect the world for this kind of setting. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know. I might do something with it on my own. Other people are welcome to take the idea and play with it, modify it, make your own stories, play your own games. I don't know. I was just I'll tell a sort of odd story. That, and I'm not trying to be Nostradamus here, but many, many years ago, when I was when I was first starting in college, this is around, I want to say 97. I want to say 97, 98 at best. There was this game that is still out there, but I don't think very well known now. It was called Conspiracy X. It was kind of this quasi X-Files, Cthulhu sort of setting. You can still find it. It's done by a studio called Eden Studios. I don't know if they're still in business, but I think you can still get the books. Anyway, I was big into X-Files back then, and Lovecraft and things like that, and aliens and conspiracies and Area 51 and all that types of stuff. And I had the core book, and I read through it, and I was just in the beginnings of my getting involved in tabletop role-playing games. And I got inspired by this book, and I tried, and there's different factions, of course, in the setting of Conspiracy X. You have the good guys, and I put in quotation marks, of the secret society known as Aegis, who are out there to protect the world from aliens and monsters and things like that. And then you have the government-involved organization called the Black Book. And the Black Book was this super duper secret undercover agency that sort of was fed off of all the other major governmental agencies to keep secret things like aliens and monsters and maybe unknowingly help them and that kind of thing. So this faction in this setting, the Black Book, they were feeding off of these other agencies, specifically their budgets and their personnel and their resources. And back in 97 or 98, I was thinking to myself, as I was trying to come up with a scenario for a role-playing game, I thought, well, and at the time, remember 97, 98, at the time, I said, well, we're in a relative period of peace. So the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, all these other governmental organizations, they certainly probably don't have the same budgets they would if there was a threat to the country. So I came up with an idea. Well, what if the Black Book, this super secret agency that, fed off of all these other agencies, what if they wanted to create a scenario to increase the budgets of all these other agencies? And I thought to myself, what kind of scenario would be necessary to have all of these agencies suddenly get flush with new funding? And I thought to myself, again, I want to reiterate, 97, 98, well, what if a series of terrorist attacks inspired the public and the government to rush to reaction to fund the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, etc.? And I came up with this scenario where the Black Book found all of these now dormant MK Ultra assets from the 50s and 60s and so on, and reactivated them to go out and carry out random terrorist attacks to inspire the government to up the budgets of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And I wrote out, similar to this that I just read out before, I wrote out like a 2 or 3 page sort of summary of the scenario, the chain of events, the reaction to these events, etc. Now, I didn't end up running that game. It just kind of sat off in a hard drive somewhere as a text document. But I never sort of forgot about it because it was one of those things where I gamed out a scenario in my head of cause and effect. You have somebody that wants something. They want to achieve that thing without being caught. How would they do that? How would the world react? And they would still get what they wanted. And then, of course, 3 or 4 years later, we had 9/11. Now, this is not me saying that 9/11 was a conspiracy theory started out in something. I don't want to promote that idea. But it shocked the hell out of me that what was the result of that? Well, we invested zillions of dollars into our defense, both domestically and internationally. The agencies involved all got increased budgets and resources and everything else. And, I was no genius. That same chain of events in the high points could have been thought up by anybody. It's not even that original an idea. But I love gaming that stuff out. Not as a predictive measure, not trying to be smarter than anybody else, but I say to myself, what would happen if, or what would require, what would be necessary to occur to lead to this outcome? So anyway, that's how I came up with this little scenario, this little setting, world building. If you've listened to all of this babbling of mine and you have ideas of your own, extensions, or anything else you'd like to say, by all means, put it in the comments. If you want to write stories of your own, based on this, or again, take this scenario and play with it and make it your own, go ahead. I've muddled over this idea for at least 2 years. Haven't done anything with it of note. I don't know if I ever will. So if this is nothing else but an inspiration for others, great. If it sits here and is listened to by only a few dozen people over the course of several years and nothing comes of it, at least I got it off my chest, so to speak. Before I sign off, let's see. Jack Gunsky says it does solve a problem that's afflicted lots of writing today. Oh, sorry, I already read that. I apologize. This is probably more right. And Johnny Hellcat says sounds kind of like Tom Clancy-ish. A little bit. I was a big fan of Tom Clancy growing up. So anyway, guys, for those of you that joined, appreciate your attention. For those of you that might be listening in the future, hope you liked it or find some use in it. For those of you that came along thinking this was going to be a live stream about BDSM, I apologize. I am deviating from the original intent of this channel a little bit. I don't know if I'll do something like this again in the future, but this channel seemed more appropriate for something like this than my main channel. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and have a good day.